We began with an introduction of Heath Stoneman as a real-life George Bailey. We then got an up-close look at facts which are incongruent with the police version of events in this case. In the third video, I showed you the open records loophole, which allows Texas law enforcement to escape public scrutiny. I also showed you that the most critical audio and video evidence in the Heath Stoneman case is mysteriously unaccounted for by the Odessa Police Department. Collectively, this established an objective basis for believing that the Odessa Police Department has engaged in a cover-up of the Heath Stoneman case. Did Heath Stoneman actually commit a crime on the night in question? Was the shooting of Heath Stoneman justified? If we can answer these questions, we might be able to figure out what was covered up and why. When Odessa, Texas police shot Heath Stoneman at 1:11 a.m. on June 6, 2012, he had been sitting on his front porch. In the dark, he was sending and receiving text messages. He was making phone calls and receiving phone calls. He was suicidal. He was issuing his goodbyes. The Odessa police tried to portray Stoneman's actions as being more sudden, unexpected, and inducing reasonable panic among police officers. They said he walked out of his house with a gun. And this may be true, but if it is, it happened 90 minutes before they shot him. It is, at a minimum, a deliberately misleading and false narrative, which we must now undo. The first point of fact in this case is that it is comprised of two separate incidents separated by 90 minutes. The police account, and the one echoed by the local media, portrayed these incidents as though they were one. At about 10:45 p.m. on June 5, 2012, Heath Stoneman's ex-wife called the police to report that she felt Stoneman's text messages indicated he was suicidal. At 10:50 p.m., two officers arrived at Stoneman's house and performed what is called a welfare check. Officers Steve Fuentes and William Upchurch knocked on his door. But Stoneman declined to speak with them, and he abruptly shut his door on them. The officers walked down the street to gather more information from the ex-wife and investigate what was going on. Supervisors arrived on the scene to begin directing the response. Sergeant Sampson and Sergeant Morrell took over the scene. Morrell attempted to contact Stoneman via his cell phone.
Do we have his cell phone number?
Yeah.
Is it 553-7458?
Yeah, I've called it.
He's not answering?
Yeah, I talked to him 3 times.
What's his attitude?
It'll be over soon.
It's so facto, huh?
Unless I can make you a millionaire.
Stoneman did pick up the calls a few times, but the conversations were brief because Stoneman simply said he didn't want to talk with the police. Morrell's written statement indicates he requested that Stoneman come outside and talk with the officers. In addition to Sergeant Morrell's invitation, there was another reason that Odessa police officers should have anticipated Stoneman coming outside. At 11:31, Officer Steve Fuentes received a phone call from Stoneman's ex-wife indicating that his plan was to kill himself outside. The scene became tense when officers heard what appeared to be gunshots coming from Stoneman's backyard. In total, they may have heard 3 gunshots. The investigation the next day revealed 3 spent shotgun shells on the ground and 3 holes in Stoneman's roof. At 11:43 p.m., Stoneman appeared in his front yard.
Hands up! Good shot!
In their written statements after the incident, officers Upchurch and Fuentes claimed that Stoneman pointed a gun at them at this time. Sergeant Rell claimed to witness this. So far, the story is based mostly on the officers' sworn statements, with some help from in-dash video to put a finer touch on where things occurred. There's a significant amount of data, and you are encouraged to examine it for yourself and cross-check facts as you see fit. It seems like everything is in order. Stoneman was suicidal and communicating his intent to his ex-wife via text messages. He seemed agitated and wouldn't talk to the police at his front door or on the phone. Gunshots were heard coming from his backyard, setting everyone on edge. He then appears in the front yard, apparently with a weapon, at a place where a shotgun was later found by investigators. The witness statements appear consistent. It seems like the police got everything right. And despite the childhood ties between this filmmaker and Stoneman, the temptation at this point was to believe the police version of events and assume that any gaps in information could be filled with reasonable explanation.
Well, how about the building alone?
Oh, confound it, man. Are you afraid of success? I'm offering you a 3 years contract at $20,000 a year starting today. Is it a deal or isn't it?
Well, Mr. Plunter, I know I ought to jump at the chance, but I wonder if it'd be possible for you to give me 24 hours to think it over.
Sure. You go on home and talk about it to your wife.
I'd like to do that.
Yeah, then in the meantime, I'll draw up the papers.
All right, sir.
Okay, George?
Okay, Mr. Potter. No, wait a minute here. Wait a minute. I don't need 24 hours. I don't have to talk to anybody. I know right now. And the answer's no. Doggone it. You sit around here and you spin your little webs and you think the whole world revolves around you and your money. Well, it doesn't, Mr. Potter. In the whole vast configuration of things, I'd say you were nothing but a scurvy little spider. And that goes for you, too. And it goes for you, too.
The problem with this in-dash video footage is that the camera is pointed in the wrong direction. However, the vehicle in the scene is pointed in the direction of the alleged crime. The footage you're watching is coming from the Upchurch vehicle, but what we really want to see is the footage coming from the Morrell vehicle. When the police claim that critical evidence is missing, just assume it directly contradicts their version of events. Then look for things that support the opposite of their claims. The first strange clue that we encounter is in the incident history detail, which is a running log of everything that happens during an incident. When we go down to the 11:40 I know, you're thinking, well, the logger just probably missed something, and surely someone said on the radio that Stoneman was threatening officers. First, this log records everything important that occurs during an event. And secondly, we listen to all of the audio, and we cannot find an all units be advised type of announcement where all of the officers are informed that Stoneman is threatening them with a weapon. Here's another example.
Okay, this subject's apparently mobile. I need to check in again. Give me your status and your location. I'm not sure exactly where he's at.
So at this point, the theory was that what we were looking for wasn't evidence that Stoneman didn't commit a crime. We were looking for the absence of evidence that he did commit a crime. With that in mind, let's take another look at the video evidence we have of the first incident.
Got a gun. Your hands up! Gun!
Now, I'm not sure about it, but I think the person who just walked out of frame is Sergeant Morrell, and I think he's holding a shotgun. I also suspect that he wasn't aligned properly to see the alleged crime. And oddly, whoever that is, they're moving towards Stoneman. But the thing that bothers me the most about this footage is that the people who allegedly had just been threatened with a gun aren't talking to one another and their colleagues and saying, hey, this guy just pointed a weapon, watch out, this is an active shooter, he's threatening us. A couple of other things bother me about this clip. First, Stoneman has allegedly committed a level 1 felony. And second, they don't know where he is. Did he go back in his house? Did he go around to the side of his house? They just don't know. So if the threat level has just gone off the charts, why is this guy walking away from the scene with his back turned to Stoneman? Maybe he did come out with a gun, but I don't think he pointed it at any police officers. They had heard gunshots, and they saw Stoneman with the gun. Naturally, they called the SWAT team to come out. But they had also allegedly just witnessed a level 1 felony. And do you know what they're supposed to do when that happens? They're supposed to arrest the subject immediately. Now, OPD might say, well, you know, at the time, we couldn't find Mr. Stoneman, therefore we couldn't arrest him. That may be true, but you had just spoken to him 5 times in 20 minutes. You could have at least called him up and let him know that he was under arrest. Not only did they not attempt to arrest him, they didn't attempt to detain him. And more importantly, they didn't make any attempt to give him a lawful order to do anything. Now that sounds crazy, but not if Stoneman didn't actually commit a crime. If he didn't commit a crime, then all of those failures and omissions make perfect sense. Absent an actual crime, what they did have was probable cause. They had the gunshots in the backyard. They had Stoneman in the front yard with a gun. They basically had enough evidence to detain Stoneman and investigate his situation further. And as part of that investigation, one thing they could do was file for a search warrant. Now, when you file for a search warrant, you can't simply list the address of the subject's house. Instead, you have to actually provide a physical description of the dwelling in the search warrant request. There have been so many poorly executed search warrants that providing an address is just not sufficient anymore. So you know what OPD had to do in order to file for their search warrant? They had to drive their armored personnel carrier up to the front of the house, get a physical description so that they could put it into the search warrant. At least that's what the SWAT members who were inside the armored personnel carrier indicated in their sworn statements to the Texas Rangers. It's also what one of the SWAT team members relayed to another officer when the actual event was occurring.
The officer still going to live up in the description of the house for the search warrant. Sierra confirmed he's on a front porch.
So why am I going on and on and on about this search warrant? Because if Heath Stoneman actually committed a crime at 11:43 p.m., in a very big way, they didn't need a search warrant. If they had just witnessed him committing a level 1 felony, they could have immediately arrested him and searched his immediate surroundings for evidence. And if they needed to perform a more extensive search, they could have filed for a search warrant at that time. So if you look at the situation from a strictly procedural point of view, OPD didn't do all of the ordinary things that you would do in the event an officer actually witnessed a felony. And their behavior captured on video and reflected in their audio communications is not consistent with a case of someone threatening officers with a gun. Keep in mind, they were taking steps to acquire a search warrant all the way up until the police shot Stoneman at 1:11 a.m. This is probably the best evidence we're going to get that the 11:43 p.m. incident was not itself a felony, i.e. an aggravated assault with a deadly weapon on a police officer. Instead, it's likely that all the OPD had on Stoneman was a possible misdemeanor charge for disorderly conduct. They didn't have enough evidence by this time, hence the search warrant, but they probably could have made a couple areas of disorderly conduct stick. Making unreasonable noise near a private dwelling is one. He didn't discharge a weapon in a public place, so that wouldn't work. However, brandishing or displaying a weapon may have been present if they could locate the weapon with the search warrant. There's also a prohibition against discharging a weapon in a city whose population is over 100,000 people, but the 2010 census says Odessa's population hadn't reached that level yet. Disorderly conduct charges in Texas are misdemeanors. I'm pointing all this out because the shooting of Heath Stoneman required justification, and a disorderly conduct charge wasn't going to supply sufficient condition to shoot him. But an aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, that would provide a justification. In Texas, the crime of assault requires the offender to make physical contact with the victim unless the offender intentionally and knowingly threatens the victim with harm. But what is a threat? A threat is a statement of an intention to inflict pain, injury, damage, or other hostile action on someone. To threaten someone is to state one's intention to take hostile action against someone in retribution for something done or not done. Something else is missing. When you go through the statements that the Odessa Police Department provided to the Texas Rangers, and you read through all of the reports that the rest of the folks that responded that night submitted, and then you go through and read all of the Texas Ranger reports, you won't find a single instance where anybody claimed that Heath Stoneman verbally threatened them in any way. Not on the phone, not in person when he supposedly pointed a gun. No verbal threat accompanying his actions whatsoever. An actual threat, unaccompanied by a verbal threat, is theater of the absurd. The reason why you're looking at videos where the police officers' patrol cars are killing their lights is because the OPD uses stealth and darkness as a tactic in serious incidents. So it wasn't just that the neighborhood was dark that night, it was that OPD's response intentionally included maintaining that darkness. Many police officers are former military. Military operations are often conducted at night. So it sort of makes sense, until it doesn't make sense. This is an officer positioned behind the house that night. He's talking to the command post and requesting to light up a spotlight so he can shine it on Stoneman's house and not be surprised if he comes out the backyard. Question: if you turn on a spotlight or your headlights on your car and you point it in the direction of Stoneman's house and then you move away from that light source and stay behind it, how does that put you in a compromised situation? It's silly, but they were serving two masters that night. On the one hand, when somebody commits a crime, the witness has to be able to see that offender, and the offender has to be able to see the circumstances in which they're committing the crime. They charged him with aggravated assault on a police officer, and so it's necessary that if you assault somebody, you can actually see them. The police are trained to conduct their activities at night, and one of the things that they learn is very basic, is that when it's dark, you have to verbally identify yourself as a police officer, because even though you might be wearing a uniform and displaying a badge, people may not be able to see it. So it's important in dark scenarios that people actually say, "This is the police." The departure on the low light scenario is necessary, but we need to get back to identifying motives, and you'll see they're both related. This is the sworn statement of Officer Upchurch. He's one of the complainants in the alleged aggravated assault charge against Stoneman. As soon as the subject opened the door, Corporal Fuentes and I verbally identified ourselves as the police. That's not a minor distinction, and it happens to be false. This is the recording of the incident from Upchurch's patrol vehicle. He's wearing an on-person recorder, and they're walking up to Stoneman's front door to perform the welfare check.
So this is a victim's house or the complainant's house? This is the
How you doing, bud? We ain't talk to you, guy.
Note that Fuentes did not misremember verbally identifying. And let's not be unfair to Officer Upchurch, because let's face it, everybody forgets. But, do you forget the same type of thing every time? Because that's what Officer Upchurch does sometimes. I observed the man step out in the light of the front yard. I turned on my light from my tactical rifle and illuminated him. I yelled at him, "Police, let me see your hands!" When the man heard me yell at him, he turned to his left toward me, and with the light on him, I saw him holding a shotgun, and he drew it up to his shoulder and pointed it at me. Two critical things. First, again, Upchurch did not verbally identify himself, and it was critical because he was out in the dark. Secondly, he didn't fully see Stoneman had a weapon until he actually shined him up with a flashlight. Well, if Stoneman is being illuminated with a flashlight, how can he see who's actually pointing the flashlight at him? How can he identify that he's a police officer?
Blinded by the lights, wrapped up like a deuce.
That's why it's critical that officers identify themselves verbally when it's dark. So here's what actually happened.
He's out. He's got a gun. Your hands up! Gun!
So no, Officer Upchurch did not verbally identify on both occasions. And yes, it does matter at night. By my count, the entire episode is over in 6 seconds. And nobody records Stoneman having said anything to any officer. A couple things I want to pull out of Officer Fuentes' statement. It says, approximately 1 minute later, I observed a white male subject walking out of what I'm assuming was the front door. The front door is recessed from the front of the house, so it was difficult for me to see what he was doing. A little bit later, he says, I was not sure if the subject went back into the residence or where he was at for that matter, due to it being dark and due to trees and shrubs obstructing my view. The other person at the scene who claimed to witness this incident was Sergeant Steve Morrell. At 11:43, the suspect came out of the front door and stood in sight. I saw him raise a long gun at Corporals Upchurch and Fuentes, but he did not fire a round. He then retreated back into the house. It's interesting that Fuentes admits that he didn't know where Stoneman came from, either the side of the house or the front door, but Morrell seems pretty certain he came from the front door and then went back into the front door. Here's Morrell 6 minutes later.
Hey, the subject's apparently mobile. I need to check in again and give me your status and location. Sure, exactly where he's at.
His written statement says Stoneman came out the front door and then retreated back into the house. But the radio shows not just that Morrell didn't know where Stoneman was, but no one else on scene did either. I guess if the witness information helps convict a suicidal subject, it should be considered reliable information. But if it has anything to do with officer safety or public safety, then be forewarned because the certainty can fall off a cliff.
712 or 721, did you see the subject? Can we possibly say he went around the side of the house, or did he go back inside?
712 and 721 are radio identifiers for Fuentes and Upchurch. It's only 7 minutes after the incident. Morrell is indicating he's not sure if Fuentes and Upchurch actually saw Stoneman. But he is apparently sure that he saw Stoneman point a gun at Upchurch and Fuentes. Pretty fishy, but the main point is they didn't know where Stoneman was at this time. Rather than turn on some lights and find him, or call him on the phone to ask him where he was. The Odessa Police Department spent the next hour evacuating the neighborhood. So far, I've showed you a list of things which the Odessa police did after the alleged incident at 11:43 p.m., which appear inconsistent with Stoneman walking into his front yard and committing a first-degree felony. Procedural omissions, no detainment, no arrest. They sought a search warrant without really needing one. But they also behaved in a way that contradicts basic officer safety. The next clip brings up a public safety issue. When you watch it, ask yourself if the Odessa Police Department really believed that Heath Stoneman had committed a first-degree felony.
The resident split out around the corner of Conley and here is evacuating this time.
10-4. CP to Sierra. The location you're at, can you give me a better description of where you're at on Revere?
The headlights you just saw came from the house on the left. That's the neighbor that's being evacuated. If the police had actually witnessed a felony committed by somebody armed with a gun, would they really evacuate the next door neighbor out their front door?
The resident split out around the corner of Conley and here is evacuating this time.
10-4. CP to Sierra. The location you're at, can you give me a better description of where you're at on Revere?
Hoping he wastes himself. Hi, Sarge. What's up? Did he shoot himself? Yeah. Okay. Nice. Figure out what happened? Make sure I'm so doing that.
We're still trying to get to the bottom of whether or not Stoneman actually committed a crime that night. And to do this, we now have to look at the second incident. Remember, there were two incidents that night, and we've been talking about the first one, and now we have to look at the second one. As mentioned previously, in response to Stoneman appearing in his own front yard and declining to speak with officers, OPD gave up attempts to communicate with him. They had a throw phone on site, but didn't use it. They had a canine unit on site, but didn't use that either. Instead, they positioned snipers in the front and back of Stoneman's house. The ones in the front found a truck about 80 yards from Stoneman's front door. They put up a cloth sheet and climbed underneath it. At about 1 a.m., they discovered that Stoneman was sitting on his front porch because his cell phone lit up and they could suddenly see him. In the meantime, at about 1:06 a.m., the armored personnel carrier drove up Conley to get the physical description of Stoneman's house for the search warrant they needed. When the APC arrived in front of Stoneman's house, it ended up blocking the view of the snipers, so they asked the APC to back up. When the SWAT team in the APC backed up, they noticed that there were neighbors in the house next door to Stoneman. They quickly formulated a plan to evacuate those neighbors by backing the APC up to the front door of the house. At 1:11 a.m., the first sniper took a shot at Stoneman and missed. 3 seconds later, the second sniper was able to shoot Stoneman through the chest, dropping him to the ground. At this point, we're not analyzing why the sniper shot him and whether or not they were justified. Instead, what we want to know is, did Stoneman commit a crime? We can see more clearly now the deception present in OPD's original version of events. They combined features of Incident 1 and Incident 2 and made it seem like Sniper shot Stoneman because he suddenly walked out his front door with a gun. But the snipers knew Stoneman was sitting on the ground talking and texting on his cell phone for 10 minutes. Among the strangest facts in this strange story is that when you read the sniper's sworn statements to the Texas Ranger investigators, you won't find in either account a direct allegation of Stoneman having committed a crime. You won't even find a direct, clear statement that Stoneman pointed his gun at them in a threatening manner. They did press charges, yes, but in their statement about what happened, neither one made clear what exactly Stoneman did, which represented an assault. Sniper John Sykes. He picked up the gun and began to raise the gun from his lap. As the man was raising the gun, I thought he had seen me and Kevin under the 4x4 pickup and was about to fire the gun at us. Sykes is 80 yards away from Stoneman. He's looking at him through a gigantic scope attached to his gun. And he's hidden underneath a truck behind a black cloth. The statement from Kevin Chance is similar, although the details vary. Chance notes that Stoneman was on his phone. In about 30 seconds, he grabbed the shotgun and held the gun in a shooting grip. He was still sitting Indian style and kind of squared off to me and John. He raised the gun part way up to his chest. He shifted his sitting position to where his natural point of aim would have been towards me and John. The gun was at an angle, away from us, but the subject started to bring the gun up and swing it in our direction. Does either account sound like they are alleging Stoneman intentionally and knowingly threatened them with a gun? Because that's what the charge of assault requires. Assume for a second that Stoneman has bionic eyes.
Better, stronger, faster.
Unlike ordinary humans, Stoneman can sit in the dark, look at a bright cell phone, put it down, and then immediately gaze 80 yards out into the neighborhood. Locate two men lying down under a truck. Using infrared, he detects them behind the concealment cloth. At this point, in order to commit aggravated assault on a police officer, they have to be identifiable as police officers. But here's how the snipers were dressed that night. Oh, but Stoneman surely knew the police were present. Really? After all the sneaking around the police did that night and refusing to communicate with Stoneman for 90 minutes? And by the way, the gun found in Stoneman's front yard that night had an effective range of 15 yards.
Never ever saw it coming at all. He never ever saw it coming at all. He never ever saw it coming at all. It's alright, it's alright, it's alright, it's alright, it's alright, it's alright, it's alright. He opened wide, here comes original sin. He opened wide, here comes original sin.
When supervisors and/or investigators started taking a closer look at the actions of the snipers that night, they must have realized they had a major problem on their hands. By law, you can't shoot people who have only committed a misdemeanor. So the misdemeanor they were seeking a search warrant to investigate magically became a felony. They allowed Sykes to gather his thoughts over the next 16 hours before putting him in front of the Texas Rangers. They gave Kevin Chance 33 hours, and he showed up with an attorney. Speaking of attorneys, Why didn't Heath Stoneman's public defender uncover any of the glaring and obvious issues? We don't know. The only clue we have is the attorney's bill to the county for defending Stoneman. The price? $1,000. We can't find a record that indicates the public defender charged the county any more than $1,000. And if you look at the attorney fee schedule and do a little bit of math, it comes out to between 6 and 13 hours of legal work. Now there's a lot of dots to connect in this case, but the major ones are the responsibility of the district attorney. And all they had to do to connect the major dots was read the statements given by the snipers, examine the crime scene photos of their concealment under the truck, and then listen to the actual audio of the shooting.
Why you drink so much, my friend? Please go home, Mr. Bailey. This is Christmas Eve.
Bailey? Which Bailey?
This Mr. George Bailey.